112. 1. One, one, two.
Take care of.
The subcommittee will come to order. We are meeting today to hear from those who will be directly and adversely impacted by the Independent Payment Advisory Board, or IPAB. In an era where our two political parties are best known for their deep divisions, this is one area where there appears to be bipartisan concern. IPAB was created in the Democrats' health care overhaul and is designed to reduce the per capita rate of growth in Medicare spending. That might sound benign, but when you peel back a couple layers, it's clear that IPAB is a real threat to Medicare beneficiaries' health. Those concerned about a government takeover of health care need look no further than IPAB. If implemented, the board will consist of 15 unelected and unaccountable Washington appointees. IPAB is given the authority to meet in secret, make its decisions in secret, and it does not need to consider the perspective of Medicare patients or their health care providers. To top it off, IPAB's rulings cannot be challenged in a court of law. My good friend from California, the ranking member, Mr. Stark, characterized IPAB as a mindless rate-cutting machine that sets up for unsustainable cuts that will endanger the health of American seniors and people with disabilities, close quote. Yet, despite the growing bipartisan opposition to this unaccountable board, the President once again proposed further expanding its authority in his most recent budget. Why is IPAB so dangerous? I have heard numerous concerns from patients and doctors, but to me, nothing is more troubling than IPAB's ability to drive a wedge between Medicare beneficiaries and their doctors. There is nothing in the Democrats' health care law preventing IPAB from slashing Medicare reimbursements for services or procedures that IPAB members feel are unnecessary or ineffective to levels so low that physicians would be willing to provide such care. As long as IPAB is allowed to exist, access to care for seniors and those with disabilities will forever be in jeopardy. IPAB supporters argue that it cannot ration care, but they won't tell you is that the term ration is not defined anywhere in the Medicare statute. This means that what is and is not rationing will be left to 15 faceless, unaccountable, and unelected appointees to decide. There is a better way. Rather than endangering Medicare beneficiaries, we should empower them. House Republicans have put forth such a plan. Our plan would let beneficiaries, not bureaucrats, decide the coverage they want and need. We have an excellent and diverse panel of witnesses here today who will share their thoughts and concerns about IPAB. We should all take note that when patients and providers are in agreement that access to care is in jeopardy, where those concerns exist, it is our fiduciary responsibility to address them. Before I recognize Ranking Member Stark for the purpose of an opening statement, I ask unanimous consent that all members' written statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize Ranking Member Stark for 5 minutes for the purpose of his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess you saw how long this was, so you slipped that 5 minutes in there on me. It's okay. I'm proud of what we've done with the Affordable Care Act. We've provided more than 2.5 million young adults with health coverage. We've reduced prescription drug costs for nearly 4 million seniors, provided free preventative care to 86 million people of all ages, and in 2014, it'll go fully into effect and expand coverage to over 30 million uninsured Americans, providing security, permanent security for those who already have coverage. That said, the Affordable Care Act is a large bill with many provisions, and none of us probably agrees with every single provision. To that point, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, or IPAB, is a provision I strongly oppose. Remember, the House included no similar provision in our health reform bill. It's a product of the other body, and we really had no part in it. Let me be clear, I oppose IPAB for reasons different perhaps from my other colleagues. Congress has always stepped in to strengthen Medicare's finances when needed. I have always worked on this subcommittee to protect and strengthen Medicare and ensure that it works for its 50 million beneficiaries. One only has to look at the Affordable Care Act, which extended solvency, slowed spending growth, lowered beneficiary costs, improved benefits, modernized the delivery system, and created new fraud-fighting tools to see that we've done a good job on this committee. I see no reason why Congress should hand that authority over to the executive branch. That undermines the separation of powers, and I won't go into detail now, but I have other concerns about IPAB's processes. I'm sure we'll hear more about that today. No one should interpret my opposition to IPAB as a knock against the ACA. I stand by my vote there, nor should anyone interpret Republican support to repeal IPAB as an attempt to improve or preserve Medicare. I still believe that the other side of the aisle would like to end Medicare, provided as a voucher, and that would underfund what's needed for individuals with disabilities. Despite my opposition to IPAB, I think it's far less dangerous than a voucher plan. It doesn't undermine Medicare's guaranteed benefits, and its ability to reduce Medicare spending has guardrails. It doesn't permit cuts to come from reduced Medicare benefits. It prohibits rationing and has annual limits on Medicare cuts. The Republican voucher plan does not have these protections. So I believe that the witnesses may share my confusion or skepticism, but I look forward to discussing with them if they believe that there's a better plan on the other side of the aisle for Medicare's future, and I'll see what the witnesses have to say. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Today we're joined by 4 witnesses: Dr. Scott Gottlieb, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute; Catherine Bay-Nice, Vice President of Government Relations at Easter Seals; Dr. David Pinson, a practicing urologist from Nashville, Tennessee, who is Vice Chair of the American Urological Association's Health Policy Council; and Marilyn Moon, Senior Vice President and Director of the Health Program at the American Institute for Research. You will each have 5 minutes to present your oral testimony. Your entire written statement will be made a part of the record. Dr. Gottlieb, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee. IPAB was created based on the premise that decisions about the pricing of Medicare benefits are simply too contentious to be handled by our political system. But changes to the way Medicare pays for medical services affect too many people in significant ways to be made behind closed doors. How Medicare prices medical products and services has sweeping implications across the entire private market. They are some of the most important policy choices that we make in healthcare. To these ends, there are some considerable shortcomings with the way that IPAB is structured and how it will operate. Among these problems, IPAB has no obligation to engage in public notice and comment that's customary to regulatory agencies whose decisions have similarly broad implications. IPAB's decisions are restricted from judicial review. In creating IPAB, Congress provided affected patients, providers, or product developers no mechanism for appealing the board's pronouncements. IPAB's recommendations will be fast-tracked through Congress in a way that provides only a veneer of congressional review and consent. For practical purposes, IPAB has been given the authority to legislate. Moreover, there's a belief that if IPAB fails to fulfill its mandate, these decisions will default to Congress. Actually, under the law, they default to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. But most significantly, IPAB is unlikely to take the steps that actually improve the quality of medical care and the delivery of services under Medicare. That's because IPAB does not have any practical alternative to simply squeezing prices in the Medicare program. The problem we have in Medicare is a problem with the existing price controls that erode healthcare productivity and Medicare's outdated fee-for-service payment system. This leads to inefficient medical care. There's too little support for better, more innovative ways of delivering health care. IPAB can pursue longer-term reforms to change incentives and behavior. These ideas, for example, aligning reimbursement with value and quality or expanding cost-sharing, don't generate savings in the short run since they're premised on long-term changes in how efficiently doctors and patients use medical services. These proposals will not produce the kind of immediate savings that IPAB needs to achieve in narrow budget windows that will be its focus. Yet these are precisely the kinds of reforms that Congress has aimed to pursue on a bipartisan basis. By doubling down on the existing practice of simply whacking price schedules with no meaningful eye to how these changes impact long-term incentives, IPAB will put more systemic payment reform further out of reach. IPAB will be working at cross purposes to Congress' broader reform goals. IPAB's need to focus on short-run manipulation of price schedules and coding procedures is evidenced by the fact that longer-term payment reforms don't score as saving money by either the CBO or the Medicare actuary who has to sign off on IPAB's recommendations. All of these ideas for broader payment reform also rely on changes in payment to providers, especially hospitals. IPAB can't do these kinds of structural reforms if these constituencies remain off limits until 2019. Moreover, because IPAB has its purview narrowly targeted to specific slices of the industry to achieve its targeted savings, IPAB may be forced to implement unusually deep cuts to the limited terrain where it can operate. These deep cuts could forestall access altogether to certain products and services. Medicare must continue to implement reforms to align its coverage and payment policies with the value delivered to beneficiaries. Congress needs to focus on real ways to get longer-term savings like premium support, modernizing benefits in the traditional Medicare program, and paying for better outcomes. IPAB makes it even harder to do all these things. If Congress believes that the political process is incapable of making enduring decisions about the payment of medical benefits, then all of this is an argument for getting the government out of making these kinds of judgments in the first place. It's not, in my view, an argument for creating an insular panel that's removed from the usual scrutiny to take decisions that other federal agencies have failed to discharge precisely because those decisions couldn't survive public examination. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Neese, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to testify. I'm Katie Neese, Senior Vice President for Government Relations at Easter Seals. For nearly 100 years, Easter Seals has provided exceptional services so that children and adults with disabilities and their families can live, learn, work, and play in the community. Last year, Easter Seals served 1.6 million individuals through a network of 75 affiliates across the country. Easter Seals' experience over these many decades has solidified our belief that when people with disabilities, regardless of age, receive appropriate health care services, they live with greater independence. This experience was one of the main reasons Easter Seals supported and continues to support the Affordable Care Act. At the same time, we strongly concur that there must be cost containment within the healthcare system and believe that more can and must be done to control costs within both public and private healthcare systems. To achieve true cost containment, Easter Seals believes that 2 important steps must be in place. First, the cost containment reforms established in the ACA must be given time to be implemented. Second, any new policies must be designed to ensure that people with disabilities can attain appropriate, medically necessary services in a timely fashion as to promote overall health and wellness. We too have concerns about the effectiveness of the IPAB that was included in the ACA. IPAB is not designed to be an instrument of delivery reform or to improve the quality of care. The charge for this board is to reduce the per capita rate of growth in Medicare spending. For people with disabilities and chronic conditions, it's through better coordination and provision of quality care that real changes in health status can be achieved and savings in the healthcare system can be realized. The language of the Affordable Care Act so limits where the IPAB can make changes that all that is really left is reducing reimbursements to providers. The board cannot take any action that would deny access to care, increase revenue, restrict benefits, or change reimbursements to hospitals or hospices. If circumstances bring about a mandated cut in reimbursement to providers, it's likely that access to quality care will be reduced and costs will be shifted to the patient. We are already experiencing a reduction in the number of healthcare providers who will participate in public insurance programs. The result is the same as if benefits were eliminated. A legislative correction such as the Medicare Decisions Accountability Act would ensure transparency and an opportunity for any beneficiary to talk with their member of Congress about how the Medicare program can reduce cost and increase quality. It would also leave on the table more options for slowing the growth of Medicare expenditures and the support of new delivery reform models. This seems the brighter path for people with disabilities and chronic conditions to assure the most impact from money spent through the Medicaid program. Again, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you. Dr. Penson, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Herger, Ranking Member Stark, and other members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on the IPAB. My name is David Penson, and I am a practicing urologist from Nashville, Tennessee. I'm speaking today on behalf of the American Urological Association, or the AUA, which has over 18,000 members and has promoted the highest standards of urologic care in the United States and the world for the last 110 years. I serve as the Vice Chair of the AUA's Health Policy Council. My testimony today does not represent the opinion of my primary employer, Vanderbilt University. The AUA strongly opposes the IPAB and calls on Congress to pass legislation that would repeal it. The AUA also participates in the IPAB coalition and is a member of the Alliance of Specialty Medicine. Both groups support full repeal of the IPAB. We believe that the IPAB, if enacted, will result in reduced access to health care for Medicare beneficiaries. Why do we believe this? We know the subcommittee is keenly aware of the ongoing issues with the SGR. Despite recent action to temporarily prevent the steep cuts to the SGR, physicians now face a 32% cut on January 1st, 2013. Clearly, this affects physicians' confidence in the Medicare program. To understand how much it affects confidence and to determine if the cuts would impact access to health care, the Alliance of Specialty Medicine last year surveyed physicians and found that more than 1/3 plan to change their Medicare status to non-participating if reimbursement is significantly cut. Another third will opt out of Medicare for 2 years and privately contract with patients. The IPAB will only make matters worse. Hospitals and other Part A providers are exempt from IPAB until 2020. In addition, the IPAB is required to make recommendations that prioritize primary care. The result will be a disproportionate share of reductions on physicians with an emphasis on specialists, including urologists. Like the SGR, the IPAB by its very nature is flawed and will result in providers leaving Medicare. Specifically, the IPAB will consist of a board of unelected individuals that lacks accountability, clinical expertise, and transparency in its proceedings. In addition, the IPAB's recommendations will be precluded from administrative or judicial review and will be enacted unless Congress specifically acts to prevent this from occurring. To understand the negative impact that IPAB would have on Americans, we can look to the current impact of a similar body, the United States Preventive Services Task Force. The task force is an independent panel composed exclusively of primary care providers and charged with making recommendations on the value of preventive services. The task force is not required, nor does it consult with the specialty areas relevant to the specific recommendations, and only recently added a public comment period in response to criticism. The task force got our attention this fall when it released new draft recommendations to discourage PSA-based screening of prostate cancer, giving it a D rating, asserting that there is no net benefit or that the harms outweigh the benefits. Based upon our review of the evidence, we strongly disagree with these draft recommendations. But the task force did not seek our opinion. In fact, the draft recommendations were developed without consultation of urologists, medical oncologists, or radiation oncologists, the very specialists who diagnose and treat prostate cancer every day. Prior to the Affordable Care Act, the task force recommendations were advisory and non-binding. Now, however, their recommendations are tied to patient cost sharing intended to encourage or limit access to certain provider services, preventive services. In short, the recommendations of the task force will limit Medicare beneficiaries' right to decide if they can be screened for prostate cancer and have reduced access to health care. You may recall a couple of years ago that the task force made similar recommendations discouraging mammograms for women in their 40s. Like the task force, the IAB is another board of unelected, unaccountable individuals that will have a similar impact on Medicare beneficiaries. However, its impact will be more severe, since the IPAB has much broader authority to alter the delivery of care. Appointed members cannot be individuals directly involved in the provision of Medicare services or have other employment. Thus, practicing clinicians, the very people who treat the patients impacted by the IPAB, are excluded from participation on the board. Although the IPAB is argued to bend the cost curve, it only serves to ratchet down costs without clinical expertise or consideration of medical evidence. Similar to the task force, it doesn't have the research capability or accountability to examine the effects of its recommendations and to determine whether the recommendations will threaten access to care. While we are in agreement that Medicare spending growth is unsustainable and payment policies are challenging, it is your duty and responsibility as elected officials to address these issues. The care of our nation's seniors and individuals with disabilities is far too important to leave in the hands of unelected board members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Moon, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Marilyn Moon, and I'm a long-term researcher in the area of Medicare with a particular emphasis on the issues that affect the consumers of the program, the beneficiaries. In this testimony, I address both the context and rationale for the IPAB and some practical issues and concerns that need to be addressed. While the IPAB raises a number of very legitimate concerns, it can be reasonable as a tool if appropriately applied. In addition to the Independent Payment Advisory Board, which is the subject of this testimony, substantial resources have been given under the ACA to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to identify, evaluate, and introduce innovations to the delivery and payment of care. This large infusion of funds to find ways to improve delivery and quality while holding down costs is at the heart of efforts to slow growth over time. It is only by identifying and implementing such change that we can expect to see improvements over time, and that is the important aspect of reform that we should be focusing on. On the other hand, the IPAB can play a role here as a backstop. Until we understand better how to use our resources more effectively and what organizations and treatments work well, it will be impossible to move forward to slow spending growth. So it is important to fully appropriate, for this to be done at the federal level, which will ensure both a very broad look at innovations and make the information available to all providers of care. Research conducted by private insurers or providers is likely to remain proprietary and to not be of the needed scope to achieve the tasks that loom before us. With these other activities, the IPAB makes considerably more sense than if it had been enacted as a standalone gatekeeper of spending. Moreover, it is important to contrast it with other alternatives that people talk about. For example, those who advocate decentralizing our Medicare program and turning decision-making over to beneficiaries place an enormous burden and risk on those beneficiaries. This is the hallmark of options that would require Medicare beneficiaries to buy insurance with a limited guarantee of subsidy from the federal government. Supporters of such an approach often talk about having beneficiaries put more skin in the game as a way of improving healthcare decision-making. Despite claims that this would create better consumers of care, they are asking the most vulnerable members of our society to make decisions for which they are likely to be poorly equipped, and I believe the evidence underscores that from the RAND experiment and other places. One positive aspect of IPAB that is often ignored, particularly when the idea is broadly challenged, is that it was explicitly set up to avoid cuts in benefits to beneficiaries and reductions in their coverage. And although the rationing aspect has I have some concerns about how well it's drafted, that is part of the idea that you're not trying to harm beneficiaries and treating this only as a backstop after other things have not worked and as a way of providing incentives to providers to be supportive of other kinds of changes, I think is the way to view the IPAB over time. There are nonetheless, though I've spoken somewhat positively about the IPAB, concerns I have that reflect the same kinds of concerns that you've already heard on the panel this morning. First, setting goals on limited time horizons and then having short periods to implement change will put enormous pressure on a system that needs to change in many ways but is not yet set up to readily adopt reforms. Fortunately, we will probably have until 2020 or 2021 before that's an issue because the changes that were made in the ACA are likely to slow the growth of Medicare sufficiently to avoid having the IPAB have to go into effect. It could use that period of time, for example, to focus on ways to incorporate more effectively these kinds of changes in the decision-making that it undertakes. Second, I have concerns about the tight conflict of interest requirements and the full-time paid status of board members that are similar to issues that other people have raised. Finally, I think the cumulative effect of very stringent controls over a long period of time needs to also be carefully examined. Tightening up on payments, requiring coordination of care, and improving the overall delivery of care are all desirable activities. But what happens if over a period of time these have happened, and as a society we want to see spending on healthcare decisions, on healthcare increase? The IPAB would be a penalty in that regard. So I think that the IPAB should certainly be changed, but I think it can be viewed as an appropriate tool in a broader context.
Thank you for your testimony. Dr. Gottlieb, some have suggested that IPAB could rely on information garnered from the experiments of another Democrat healthcare tool, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, to develop cost-saving policies. However, many members, including myself, have serious concerns that CMMI was given a blank check with no accountability to beneficiaries or to Congress. Are you concerned that the interactions between IPAB and CMMI could lead to a perfect storm, such as these government bodies will have unchecked powers to change Medicare in ways that neither beneficiaries, providers, nor Congress can appeal?
I think the interplay between IPAB and CMMI certainly it could be significantly problematic. IPAB could effectively authorize new authorities onto CMS, and then CMMI could provide the funding for it. So you basically completely sidestep Congress. I think one can imagine IPAB skirting prohibitions on changes in cost sharing or benefit by authorizing or instructing the Innovation Center to use a more restrictive standard for what Medicare will cover, and then providing CMMI would provide the funding to implement that. I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that if IPAB's constituted, it'll pursue some kind of reference pricing scheme like LCA authority, conferring LCA authority explicitly onto Part B drugs, something CMS has already sought and lost a number of federal court cases in seeking that authority. And CMMI could effectively create the infrastructure to execute that. And so you'd have the two entities working together to effectively accomplish what traditionally has been done by Congress, granting authority and then providing funding for it.
Thank you. Ms. Neese, you're not alone in expressing unease about IPAB. In fact, I've heard from a number of patient groups that have shared similar concerns that IPAB need not count a single patient representative among its 15 members. Can you discuss why you think it's important for beneficiaries to have a strong voice while this unelected board is making decisions to cut Medicare?
Absolutely. In the disability rights movement, we have a phrase, nothing about us without us. Patients and beneficiaries are essential in this decision-making process. People know what their bodies need. They know what they need, and simply having the dollars of what you pay a provider be the only factor in the decision-making process, to us, is simply missing the point. We really need people to be invested in their own health, and to make that opinion be part of this decision-making process.
Thank you. Dr. Pinson, the President and key officials in his administration claim that IPAB will strengthen Medicare. The President and these officials are also quick to claim that IPAB supposedly cannot ration care, increase beneficiary cost sharing, or reduce benefits. To me, this means that the only thing that IPAB can do to cut Medicare spending is to slash payments to providers. Do you believe that simply cutting provider payments strengthen the Medicare program, or do you think it will weaken the program by reducing beneficiary access to care?
I absolutely agree with you that I think it will weaken the program. The fact of the matter is that if you reduce reimbursements to physicians, there are many physicians out there in the community now who are struggling, particularly primary care providers, but specialists as well, And what I think will happen is if you reduce reimbursements, you will have providers leaving the system, leaving the program, and then that will reduce access for beneficiaries.
Thank you. Mr. Stark is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the reasons that I was happy to see ACA pass is that it was successful in constraining healthcare spending and extended the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund, slowed the cost growth in Medicare and growth in overall national health spending, all while lowering beneficiary cost sharing. In fact, CBO estimates that Medicare spending growth is so low, given the Accountable Care Act, that IPAB won't be triggered until after 2021, I think, as Ms. Moon indicated. Could you tell us, Ms. Moon, how ACA is lowering the Medicare spending and how you suspect it may continue to do that in the future? It's my understanding that the cost containment from ACA means that, as you said, IPAB won't be triggered for years. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Certainly. A number of the changes that were made in the Medicare program will reduce the level of spending over time. There are a number of them. One of them that I think was particularly important, for example, was to try to set on an equal footing with the traditional Medicare program, the Medicare Advantage aspects of the program, in which now those private plans will be paid on a level comparable to what Medicare beneficiaries in traditional Medicare will get. I think that was a very positive move forward, for example, and a substantial piece of this. I think other areas in which the projections of lower spending are important are going to come from the innovation center of this new activity by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And unlike those who fear what it will do, I think that finally we are putting resources into looking at very systematically and carefully what things work to improve the delivery of care in the United States, recognizing that a lot of changes are going to have to be made. Some of these are not going to be easy and they're going to be tough changes, but I think they will get the kind of scrutiny that they need when they are put out there, as the CMMI does, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovations, and that is by doing research and analysis and then talking about the findings and how they can change over time. That's much more transparent than will happen, for example, if these changes are made by private insurance companies in their own efforts to hold down costs.
I'm sure you're aware of, well, not only Canada, but I think almost all nations except Somalia and someplace else have basically an effectiveness study which would help patients and physicians without regard to cost, but through a study of how effective various procedures or various pharmaceuticals are. Is aspirin better than Tylenol? Somebody will do a study on that and suggest to Dr. Penson that for this particular issue or that particular issue, the statistics would show that this is more effective. Should that, over time, provide better service to all Americans, but in particular to the Medicare beneficiaries, if the physicians chose, it's a voluntary issue, to follow its recommendations? I'll ask Dr. Penson if that would be useful, would be helpful in his practice.
Well, I'm, as I also wear a second hat as a health services researcher who focuses on comparative effectiveness. So evidence-based medicine is very important. The AUA supports it. I support it. I will add, though, that sometimes we do a study and it clouds this issue even more so. But evidence is very important for the practice of medicine, absolutely.
Ms. Moon?
I think that that is key to the future because we really have to understand how to use our resources wisely. And as you indicated, this should be advisory to physicians and other providers of care. It is difficult to ask physicians in this very fast-changing world to be on top of everything, and good and reliable information about what works and what doesn't is going to be an essential piece of that.
Thank you. I want to thank the entire panel for their contribution. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am appalled by the government control of everything, and I think we need to get the government out of it. You know, unelected and an unaccountable board trying to tell you docs what you can and can't do is ridiculous. Are you still doing Medicare?
I am personally. I work for a large academic medical center, so I suspect my medical center will always be in Medicare. I can tell you many of my colleagues are considering not participating, particularly if the SGR cuts go through.
Yeah, I know. I'm aware of a couple of docs that are thinking about going to the military and getting out of private medicine. That's ridiculous. Dr. Gottlieb, Secretary Sebelius testified before the committee just last week and claimed IPAB is prohibited from rationing care-altering benefits. It's difficult to imagine that with this administration and its Washington knows best mentality that they could decide services and procedures aren't warranted. As a result, they might recommend slashing Medicare reimbursements for those services and procedures. Do you see this as a possibility? Could you comment on it?
Well, I think they're going to be forced to manipulate payment schedules and coding because they need to achieve budget savings in the near term, and in the near term, that's all you really can do, given the other constraints. I mean, what they're likely to do is import price schedules that exist in one aspect of the market into new aspects of the market, so you can envision things like maybe VA pricing for the specialty tier drugs and the Part D benefit. They're likely to just burn down existing payment rates, just drive them lower, and they're likely to try to do things to the coding process to try to change how certain products are reimbursed, maybe giving CMS authority to engage in forms of reference pricing. I think that the way that IPAB is likely to ration, if you will, is by just conferring new authorities onto CMS, authorities that CMS has long wanted, to be able to engage in aspects of what really amounts to reference pricing, where you would categorize products along a judgment made by CMS that products are clinically interchangeable. So, for example, consolidating drugs with separate Orange Book listings under the same payment code, even if those drugs are paid separately, CMS could theoretically say that they think that they're clinically interchangeable, and just applying least costly alternative authority, saying that within a category of approaches to a given medical problem, CMS doesn't recognize a clinical difference between different approaches and is therefore going to pay for the lowest rate. I think that that's what we're likely to see. As far as rationing, I'm not sure. There is no definition of rationing in the statute, so I'm not sure how that's likely to be interpreted. And since you can't sue IPAB for implementations of its recommendations, I'm not sure how you can challenge that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Do you think Medicare can be saved with arbitrary reimbursement cuts, or do we need more fundamental reform?
Well, I agree with you, Congressman. I think we need more fundamental reform. I think that this endless series of just burning down payment schedules and trying to lump different treatments under the same payment code to bring sort of bureaucratic efficiency to the management of the program just makes more fundamental reform more difficult. So as we go through successive cycles of these arbitrary cuts, I think it makes it harder and harder to achieve something more fundamental.
Yeah, I'm seeing some docs just getting out of it. They're not accepting it anymore. Do you still? You said you did.
I do, because I'm an employee of a medical center. But I'll repeat what I said before, which is I know many of my colleagues have either left Medicare or considering leaving Medicare because they're worried, frankly, about keeping the lights on.
Yeah, it's a serious problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Reichert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. As you can see, there's some agreement on this panel this morning, and you've, I think, answered most questions through your testimony, so some of these might be repetitive, but I think some of the topics bear a highlighting during the questioning. And I've only been on this committee, this is going on my 4th year, and I know some members have been here much longer than that. They've been struggling with health care and health care reform and lowering costs and increasing accessibility and quality versus quantity for a lot longer than I have. But it's become obvious to me in my short tenure on this committee that there are some serious problems with this so-called Affordable Health Care Act. We've already removed language regarding the 1099 form. We've also, the Class Act is one part of the program, or a program removed from the health care law. It's not affordable. There are other issues, as you know, regarding mandates. So now we have lawsuits filed as a result of this law being passed. And now we've also discovered that if you like your health care plan, you can't keep it. And then, so today, we're here to talk about another problem that there's agreement on with this panel, at least in the beginning of this discussion, and that is this advisory board. And most of you have touched on this already, but again, I want to highlight what Dr. Penson especially said in his testimony. The advisory board only serves to worsen the problem of physicians leaving Medicare, and Mr. Johnson just spoke briefly to this too. Can you explain how the advisory board can restrict access to care for our nation's seniors? That you've explained, at least in one case, prostate cancer, for example. The screening has been rated now as a D rating, which is going to restrict some coverage there and some access. Patient cost sharing is designed to limit access. Can you give some other examples of how access will be limited and why?
Well, I think specifically with the IPAB, it's primarily going to be cutting reimbursements to physicians, not just at specific tests like the task force did with prostate cancer. But that being said, if we continue to cut reimbursement to physicians, we're going to have a crisis because physicians are going to leave the Medicare program. And it's going to happen not just with primary care providers, but specialists. These days, doctors, particularly community physicians, are working on a very tight margin. And if you continue to cut their reimbursements, they're going to close their doors, or they're going to stop seeing Medicare patients. And effectively, you're going to have American seniors saying, well, maybe I need to pay out of pocket to see my doctor I've been seeing for 10 years because he no longer will accept Medicare. I see that as a huge problem, and it effectively is rationing depending on how you define it.
And just to follow up on this idea, Ms. Neese, I liked your no discussions about us without us. And if you could just elaborate a little more on that as to help us understand how Medicare changes and reforms are impacting beneficiaries, and especially if they're not there to represent their own views, thoughts, and ideas, and us as representatives have no place at the table to represent those individuals most in need that your organization particularly represents. Can you go into some detail on that?
Sure, and I think if I could be so bold, I think Dr. Penson might agree with us. One of the ways that we are healthy is when we have good relationships with our healthcare providers. It's a two-way street. Your doctor tells you what you do, and then you're supposed to do it, and that doesn't always happen. But there needs to be direct communication with the patient and their healthcare provider, and when that happens in a positive way, people have better health. It's not very complicated. If you take that patient-doctor relationship out of the delivery of health care so that it's harder to stay with your doctor, you're going to somebody new every time, it can be very, very difficult.
Would you say the board is sort of doing this then?
If you make it so doctors can't stay in the Medicare program, and we are seeing this, and I know it's not jurisdiction of this committee, but we are seeing this every day in the Medicaid program, where healthcare providers simply are no longer taking children with disabilities who are on Medicaid because they cannot afford to pay their light bill and do this. It's not that they are being inappropriate in any way. They cannot stay open if they continue to serve these patients. We fear the same thing may be true with Medicaid, with Medicare, if it's constantly, if there are fewer people. I can give you one very quick example. I have a very dear friend who has spina bifida. She's in her mid-50s. She has been on Medicare for times when she, and she's had over 50 surgical procedures. When she goes to a new doctor, they want a full medical history. She's 50 years old. She's had 50 surgeries. They don't need to know if she's got something wrong with her stomach when her legs were amputated. And that is an inefficiency in the system that if you make it harder for the people who know their patients to stay in Medicare, you're going to have less good health outcomes for patients.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Pasquale is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been pointed out many times in this room, Mr. Chairman, how critical it was that health care reform included the cutting-edge delivery and payment reforms that it did. I'll refer back to this in a moment. But I've never believed that the Independent Payment Advisory Board, as it stands now, will effectively fulfill its stated mission in terms of cost containment. I never really accepted that. I have concerns with how IPAB will operate and that it gives us important congressional authority over pricing. That is why I'm co-sponsor of the bill, and I'm going to intend to support it in committee and on the floor. But let's be clear that the IPAB was originally designed to protect beneficiaries. That was its purpose. Despite what my friends on the other side would have you believe, it is their voucher plan that they endorsed, the majority endorsed, that would end Medicare as we know it. That's what would end Medicare as we know it. So while we may be talking about repealing IPAB today, we should not lose the big picture, and that is the Affordable Care Act was entitlement reform. Nobody wants to say that on the other side. I don't know why 1/3 of the act was entitlement reform, as far as I'm concerned, concerning Medicare. Very specific. Unlike their plan, it will actually contain Medicare costs while improving benefits, not ending the Medicare guarantee. And I had a question for Dr. Moon, but I want a quick question, if you would, Ms. Neese. You know, that vouchers are not going to work for individuals with disabilities. Let's set the record straight here.
That's absolutely right. Our experience, whether it's been in healthcare or in education, what people with disabilities need is what they need.
So what the voucher program does is turn people with disabilities and senior citizens over to private health insurance industry. It turns it over to them to determine what care and how much care they're going to receive. Can you just briefly talk about converting Medicare to a voucher and what it would do to the very people you are focused on?
Over time, the Medicare program and others have been altered to include specific services and supports. Those were because people needed them, and we needed to spell out in very specific ways that there was a range of services that needed to be reimbursed by the Medicare program. People need those services, and because it's a big pool, not everyone's going to need the same amount, but they need to be able to have medically necessary services available to them as decided by their health care provider, and not say if you cost more than $15,000 a year, too bad for you. If you have a stroke and you need ongoing physical therapy to regain the strength in one side, right, you need that. And it's not, and you may need, depending on you as an individual, you might need physical therapy for 2 months or you might need it for a year.
Thank you. Dr. Moon, we know of the various and very specific cost containment under the Affordable Care Act. Just to name a few: efforts to reduce preventable hospital readmissions, improving payment accuracy, has an effect on what we're talking about, promoting value-based purchasing, et cetera, encouraging innovation through the new Center for Medicare and Medicaid Center, establishing and funds research on effectiveness of different clinical interventions with the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. These are among many. Now, do you think it's likely that IPAB will focus on improving quality through delivery system reforms, considering how hard CBO showed it is to create any savings in such a small time frame?
I think that's a very legitimate concern about IPAB, and I think that if there were to be changes in the program that kept it, it should allow it to have a longer time frame than the 1 year. I think that's a dangerous aspect of the IPAB program.
What do you think would be the result of that?
I think that does bias you in favor of some of the cuts in payments, and that's something that I think you want to avoid. Again, I see IPAB mostly as a backstop if it's absolutely necessary, and I would hope it would be viewed that way and not as a first line.
The
Thank you.
gentleman's time has expired. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I think the witnesses that we've heard over many, many weeks and many hearings are an indication, they're an indication of the concerns, legitimate concerns of folks who are involved day in and day out with health care. I think all sides should just back off an inch or two at least and take a look at what we're learning as might not be the causes of the major problems we're facing in health care, and that we can all take a deep breath, Mr. Chairman, all take a deep breath and understand that we, our combined intellect here, need to look at reducing
the gentleman's
one thing,
time has expired. Thank you
reducing
very
one thing,
much.
and not throwing away
Mi-
the entire essence of the bill.
Mr. Roscom's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, in that spirit of taking a deep breath, the Democratic leader of the House, when she was the Speaker, sort of famously now prophesied that we had to pass the bill in order to see what was in it. And she did, and we do. Now we're walking through this IPAB adventure. And I think what's interesting, to the gentleman from New Jersey's point, and I accept the premise of what he's saying, and that is there's nobody here, it's interesting, no voice on this panel is defending IPAB. Nobody. We've heard, well, it didn't start in this chamber. We've heard it's not, you know, this wasn't the real purpose. But it's fascinating that, at least to date, an hour into this hearing, there has been no voice that has defended on this panel the status quo of IPAB. So let's talk about why. Dr. Gottlieb, can I turn to you? And let me ask you this. Under IPAB, will healthcare providers' ability to provide care to patients be affected by reimbursements being cut for particular services?
I think it absolutely will. You know, as we've been saying, I think IPAB's sort of scope is so narrow and constrained in terms of what it can do and how far out it can look, getting to Ms. Moon's point, that it's going to just have to burn down payment rates. And we've seen time and time again, when payment rates get driven too low, certain services just become unavailable. If you look even under the DRG system, when DRGs get driven down too low, certain technologies will fall out and just won't be available in the hospitalized setting. I think the same thing's likely to happen on the Part B side in the outpatient setting, as IPAB has to just burn down payment rates and manipulate coding schedules.
So the downward pressure, in a nutshell, the downward pressure is so fierce that it will have an impact. Let me ask you this. The debate around the word rationing has created a high level of anxiety. You know, and so the proponents of the Affordable Care Act say, well, the IPAB can't ration. Rationing, as you know, is not defined in the statute. Let me ask you this. Can you have per se rationing based on what the Independent Payment Advisory Board makes decisions to reimburse?
Sure, you're going to have payment driven so low in some settings that certain services just won't be available, physicians won't be available to take patients. I think entrepreneurship is going to suffer because you're going to have less investment in certain sectors in anticipation of the inability to get reimbursement for certain things. And I think that the third leg of this is the fact that IPAB could confer authorities, give CMS new authorities so CMS can engage in the rationing. I don't see, I'm not an attorney, I'm a physician, but you know, I've spoken to attorneys in town. There's mixed opinion about this issue, but most people seem to agree that IPAB can confer authorities onto CMS that CMS would then use in ways to explicitly change benefit design and coverage rules.
Ms. Neese, on behalf of Easter Seals, I'm interested. I've got world-class Easter Seals facility in Villa Park, Illinois, which is doing remarkable work. And I've had the privilege of visiting and really commend you and the vision and the mission that you have. Can you comment on what you're hearing from, let's say, parents of children whom you're serving and their level of concern about what patients or what physicians might be prescribing based on an IPAB decision? In other words, if IPAB makes a decision, is the smorgasbord of options, treatment options, possibly cut down as a result of the bureaucratic decision-making process?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, you do have one of our superstars in your district, which serves predominantly children and children with very significant physical disabilities. Our biggest concern is when you make it impossible for providers to stay in business and serve this population, they have no place else to go. And so the practical reality is, particularly in smaller communities where you may not have the same degree of the breadth and scope of providers, if they cannot keep their doors open because reimbursement is the only thing that is keeping them afloat, and that just gets cut, then practically speaking, people are just afraid that those services, regardless of what's on the benefit package, if there's nobody to provide them, then they can't access those services.
Thank you. Dr. Penson, quickly, there's a lot of discussion in this town about income inequality. You mentioned this a minute ago, but can you give us a little bit of a highlight? What happens, for example, if a person of means goes in and a physician, well, my time's expired.
Maybe you can answer it in writing. You want to finish the question?
That's okay. I'll follow up with you. Thank you.
Mr. Kind is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this important hearing, and I appreciate the witnesses' testimony here today. I would be the first to admit that IPAB requires a leap of faith, but I supported it. I think it makes sense. I think it is a fail-safe backstop effort to constrain the largest and fastest growing area of spending in the federal budget, and state budgets, and local budgets, and business budgets, and family budgets, which is healthcare costs. And if people have a better idea of how we can bend the cost curve out in the future, I'm all for that as well. But I think the key to reforming a healthcare system that was in desperate need of reform was through delivery system reform and through payment reform. Got to change the way healthcare is delivered so it is more integrated and coordinated and patient-focused. And we have a lot of models throughout the country that have shown us ways to do that. And then ultimately, we've got to change the way we pay for healthcare, so that we're paying for the value or the quality or the outcome of care that's given and no longer the volume of care. And that has been the nemesis of the so-called fee-for-service system for years. And everyone on this panel, I think, recognizes the challenge that we're facing. Fee-for-service is not producing the type of outcomes or the bang for the buck that we need with our health care dollars. IPAB is merely, from my perspective, is a fail-safe mechanism that if certain reforms don't lead to spending reductions and better outcomes, there's a way to address that. And one of the big problems out there is the overutilization of healthcare. More tests, more procedures, more things being done, but without the desired results. But we've got competing ideas on which way to go. The other side, from what I can tell, would just as soon shift the costs on the backs of people who can least afford it. Ms. Moon, let me start with you. For example, under the so-called Ryan budget plan that virtually all of them had supported last year, the Republican plan would end Medicare's guaranteed benefits for things like hospital stays and doctor visits. They would replace it with a cash voucher. Can IPAB do that?
No, it cannot.
Also under the Republican plan would increase the cost for Medicare beneficiaries, according to the CBO analysis of it, by more than doubling out-of-pocket costs for new enrollees, up to $6,000 a year when it's fully implemented. Can IPAB accomplish that?
No, fortunately, it would not.
And finally, the latest version, apparently, that they're toying with and might include in their next budget resolution is the so-called Ryan-Wyden plan that embraces this concept of a target growth rate, that if certain spending reductions don't occur, automatic spending reductions occur under this target growth rate. Does IPAB mirror any of that?
No.
You know, so there's really a choice here of what we can do moving forward. Allow time to transpire for delivery system and payment reform to take place, whether it's the ACO models or medical homes or the better coordinated care, the Center for Innovation coming up with ideas and how we can get better value for the dollar, and have IPAB as a backstop for that ultimately, or we can go down another route, which merely privatizes Medicare, turns it into a private voucher plan, shifts the costs on the backs of seniors, an additional $6,000. And when I look at my congressional district, 80% of the seniors in western Wisconsin rely on Social Security as their sole source of retirement income. 80%. They can't take a $6,000 hit in Medicare. So what I think we need to be working on is what we can do together of trying to reform a delivery system so we do get better value out of the dollars. Am I wrong here, Ms. Moon? Am I missing something of what needs to be accomplished in the healthcare system?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that this is a very tough problem, and the federal government has a role to play along with consumers and providers and everybody else, and to shift it off onto beneficiaries and make them responsible.
Well, the way I see IPAB ultimately is a panel, again, a backstop if cost constraints don't occur, that they'd kick in, their relevancy would kick in. But their whole task is to find out what's working and what isn't, and then stop creating incentives for doing things that don't work. I mean, in its simplicity, that's what IPAB is really all about. And I support it because I've been around here long enough to see how feckless Congress is trying to act on these reimbursement issues ourselves. I know there's great cause for representative democracy, but you just look back at SGR and what an abysmal failure SGR has been throughout the years. It was a budget savings mechanism inserted in '97 that has always been restored, and that's the problem we always have with these reimbursement issues. Congress doesn't have the backbone or the guts to stand up and try to make these decisions ourselves, because we're not experts. And yet IPAB is supposed to be staffed with people with greater knowledge and greater expertise in order to make some of these difficult decisions. Congress can still intervene. There's still that mechanism. But I feel more confident going down the IPAB road than not, given what we face today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Price is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's so much misinformation in the last 5 minutes, I don't know quite where to start, but maybe I'll start by saying that the SGR, which all of us agree is a disaster in terms of its compensation of physician reimbursements for physician services for seniors, everybody understands that. The IPAB has been called the SGR on steroids. So if you like the SGR, you'll love the IPAB. Our whole goal here is the highest quality of care. We disagree drastically about how to get to that highest quality of care. Our side believes that patients and families and doctors ought to be making medical decisions. The other side believes that Washington ought to be influencing those medical decisions in very intimate ways, which is why I think it's important to point out, Mr. Chairman, that a list of medical entities, physician entities, folks taking care of patients, nearly 500 of them supporting repeal of the Independent Payment Advisory Board. So it's important to remember that we're talking about patients, and the people that are taking care of the patients are saying this will be a disaster, a disaster. We've heard a couple things from our friends on the other side who say, oh, don't worry about it, it's 2020, 2021, not going to happen. I draw their attention to Appendix A in their packet, the first date where something regarding IPAB must occur by law, April 30th, 2013. 2013. That's when the chief actuary has to begin to state whether or not these costs are going up at rates that are unacceptable, not according to patients, not according to any market at all, but according to Washington. We've heard that the words tossed around like voluntary and advisory as it relates to IPAB. There's nothing voluntary or advisory about the Independent Payment Advisory Board. It's a denial of care board, and its sole purpose is not quality of care, as my colleague just talked about. Its sole charge is to, quote, recommend cuts in areas of excess cost growth. Decrease costs, excess cost growth, then you got to look at why the cost of health care is rising. And it's rising higher than the gross domestic product. Why? For two main reasons. We heard this last week from the chief actuary for CMS as well as the OMB director. The 2.5% is due to, quote, utilization and innovation. Utilization and innovation. So if you're going to decrease the cost, what do you have to do? You have to decrease innovation, that's quality of care, and utilization, that's access to care. which brings me to my questions to first Dr. Penson. There's some notion that if you decrease payment to physicians, that doesn't decrease the access to care for patients. Can you help us understand that mechanism a little bit?
Well, it's going to affect, you decrease reimbursement to physicians, it's going to affect things in two ways. First is the example I've thrown out there already, which is at a certain point, physicians are going to close their doors and turn off the lights simply because they can't make ends meet. And so for many physicians, they'll just opt out of Medicare, and we've already seen this in Medicaid. The other thing that physicians will do is if they get paid, if the reimbursement gets paid less, if they try to keep their doors open, keep things open for Medicare, they'll just try to see more patients. Now, you say, okay, well, that's good. We want our doctors to see as many patients as possible. But Ms. Neese will back me up on this. There's a big difference between when you get, and you know this as a physician, you get a good long visit with your doc where you get to talk to him or her, or you're sort of in and out really quickly, because that's what he or she has to do just to keep the office open.
Dr. Gottlieb, I want to talk about some real-world consequences for the physicians out there trying to care for their patients in spite of the rules that we toss upon them. My understanding is that if a physician is continuing to try to see Medicare patients, and if a payment for a service in Medicare is not of a rate that would allow the physician to continue to keep his or her doors open, that physician can't see that Medicare patient and provide that service if they agree upon another price that the patient would want to pay to that physician to see him or her. Is that right?
Oh, that's right. Under the law, you can't balance bill the patient. You have to accept the customary rate under Medicare if you opt into the Medicare program. I think the other caveat here, and what I'm seeing in my clinical practice, I practice hospital-based medicine, but I'll refer the patients to primary care providers as a discharge from the hospital. And what I see more and more is just physicians capping how many Medicare patients they'll allow into their practice, and they'll say, I'm closed to new Medicare patients. We've seen this in Medicaid for years now. It's very hard to get specialty care for Medicaid patients that I'm discharging from the hospital. It's quite unfortunate.
And therefore, huge decrease in access to care. In fact, last week when the Secretary was here, she said 98.4% of physicians see Medicare patients. I asked her specifically how many physicians are decreasing the number of Medicare patients that they're seeing, and the Secretary could not answer that, and it's a huge, huge number. Access to care is being compromised. IPAB damages access to care, and it's time to repeal it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank the witnesses for being here today, taking your time. I represent 170,000 seniors in Southwest Florida, Sarasota and Manatee counties. And many of the seniors that I talk to are very concerned about what this unelected board of bureaucrats will mean to Medicare as it decides what constitutes necessary care for our seniors. Dr. Penson, you represent doctors who are concerned about this board. How do doctors feel about President Obama's call to expand the reach in terms of this board?
I think in general, the doctors who I represent in the American Urological Association are strongly opposed to this board, and they certainly wouldn't favor any expansion of it.
Dr. Gottlieb, I had a quick question. You mentioned in your testimony that the decision of this unelected board of bureaucrats are exempt from judicial review. I find this very concerning. Please explain to us what the full consequences of this exemption are.
Well, my understanding by talking to attorneys in town is that the implementation of the board's provisions are exempt from judicial review. So effectively, if you're a sponsor, if you're a company manufacturing a product or even a provider group affected by a decision of the board, you wouldn't have legal standing to challenge a decision in court. You also don't have any ability to appeal. There's no appeals mechanism. I had my research assistant at AEI, and I don't have it with me here today, do a survey. We're going to be publishing it soon of all the mechanisms in place on private health care plans, what they have in terms of adjudication. And, you know, I don't think Congress would ever allow a private plan to operate the way IPAB is going to operate in terms of not allowing any mechanism for appeal or any open process in terms of how these decisions get made. And the private sector obviously does a much better job at this, frankly, because they have to under the law.
And let me, just a follow-on question that was brought up the other day, that if the Congress doesn't like what gets done at IPAB, what kind of reach or what's their ability to try to overturn a decision as you understand it? Because I've heard different comments on that.
Well, there's sort of a veneer of congressional consent built in, right, where the proposals of IPAB go to Congress for a very limited time, and that Congress would have to come up with proposals that cut Medicare by the same magnitude if they didn't like the proposals that IPAB put forward. I think it's unlikely Congress is going to be able to come up with competing proposals in the time frame that they're allowed under the law. So it's effectively a way to fast-track the IPAB proposals into law and provide a veneer of congressional consent, I assume, because there were separation of powers issues if it didn't go before Congress. Now, Congress can always pass a law later to repeal the IPAB provisions, but I think the whole idea here is that the idea was to make it very politically hard to do anything to stop the implementation of IPAB's proposals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from the New York Times called Knotty Challenges in Healthcare Costs. This points out that the average cost of health care per capita in the United States is $8,000, which is twice what it is in every European country. So we all know there's a cost problem. I don't think anybody up here disagrees. And the question is, I guess Bill Frist said it pretty well in my view. He said, don't repeal it, fix it. So I'm sitting here trying to figure out, people don't like the IPAB. I think it's as good a mechanism as we have, and we'll fix it on the way. Maybe we'll figure out better ways. But the question is, how do you fix? Let's just take one area, doctors' fees. Now, when we started Medicare, we said to the doctors, you can submit your usual and customary fees. That was the deal. The doctors weren't coming in unless they got their usual and customary fees. Okay. So now, Dr. Penson, you sit out there at Vanderbilt University. Do you decide your fees?
No, I do not.
Well, who does?
Well,
An accountant?
I believe the physicians and the leadership at Vanderbilt University, and I understand.
No, wait a minute. You mean you don't set them, they're set by the university?
And by the payers in the region.
The payers of the regions?
Payers in the region, the insurers.
So United Health sits down with Vanderbilt and says, here's what we'll pay, send me a bill for that amount? Is that the idea?
I don't know the exact mechanism, honestly.
Isn't that interesting? Now here we have a doctor who doesn't know how his pay comes. And what we have written into law right now is doctors can submit any fee they want, and then the government is supposed to write a check and pay them exactly what they asked for. Well, then somebody's got to make a decision on how much doctors should be paid, right? Now the question, here's what I'd like Ms. Moon and Dr. Penson and Mr. Dr. Gottlieb to talk about. How should it be done? Should it be members of Congress up on this dais decide? Or should it be by the doctors? The doctors should decide how much they're paid? Because doctors will always say, I was not paid my fees. Of course you weren't paid your fees. They were too high. And Aetna or United Health or somebody said, no. We're only paying this much. Or should it be done by a board that sits and talks about? What is the answer to this question of setting fees? How should it be done?
Thank you, Congressman. I would just say up front, we don't have a cost problem in medicine. I think we have a value problem in medicine, and the question is, are we getting what we paid for? And I think most of us would agree.
Well, who decides the value?
I know how my fees are established, and they're established, frankly, by Medicare. I mean, I'm paid. Most of the patients I see are Medicare patients or Medicaid patients, and where I do have private pay patients,
what do you
I'm
get?
paid off of Medicare rate.
You submit $100. What do you get back?
When I see patients in the hospital, I'll fill out a sheet at the end of a day, and I'll submit billing codes. They're Medicare billing codes, regardless of whether it's a Medicare patient or a private patient. The private plans use the same billing codes. And there's a fee schedule assigned to the billing codes, and that fee schedule is established by Medicare, and the private plans will pay a percentage off of that schedule. Medicare rates vary across the country because costs vary across the country, so Medicare varies the rates based on surveys that it does of the actual cost of providing care. But that's how all physicians are paid, unless they're taking cash.
Well, how would you fix that? You don't like that system, and it's costing us too much. We're paying twice what the French and the British and the German, everybody else is paying for health care, and our health statistics aren't better. So how do you fix this payment thing? Because
Well,
paying whatever we're paying isn't buying it.
This gets to the question of, do we tweak things, or go from a fundamental reform? I mean, first of all, the whole coding process for how physicians are paid is done behind closed doors. The AMA effectively has a monopoly on establishing the codes.
So you'd be willing to look at the RUC committee?
I think you have to open up the RUC. I think it should be a competitive process, and I think ideally you want to move as many services and products as you can into places where they can be bid in competitive markets. We've seen that bidding products in a competitive market works in Part D. Prices have been driven down. I would move other aspects of Medicare into competitive schemes where those services and products get bid in competitive markets.
Dr. President?
Well, Dr. Gottlieb is clearly smarter than I am. I'm just a dumb urologist. But I will tell you, having practiced in Los Angeles before I was in Tennessee, it's a similar experience as far as what I get paid is set by the payer, whether it's Medicare or the private payer. And the institution I work for obviously negotiates that charge. I don't have the fix, but the fix isn't just simply cutting physician fees. You need fundamental reform. I don't have the answer. I don't think anyone does. That's why we're here.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Gerlach is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe that's a good segue into a line of questioning, particularly to Dr. Moon. Thank you for testifying today, by the way, all of you on the panel. Dr. Moon, in your written testimony, you indicate that you support the reasonableness of the goals of IPAB, but there are some serious challenges, quote unquote, that ought to be addressed. And specifically, you say that setting goals on limited time horizons and then having short periods to implement change will put enormous pressure on the system. Instant savings should not be expected nor used to measure success. This may create a bias in favor of less complicated changes, such as payment limits, which is what the doctors have described and others have described as well. That there needs to be perhaps a more nuanced approach encouraging delivery system reforms. That leads to this whole issue of how are we finally going to attack the fraud that's in the system in particular. We had Secretary Sebelius here last week, and she indicated in her testimony that they've undertaken health care fraud reforms that will generate $3 billion over 10 years of savings. Well, that sounds like a pretty good step in the right direction, except for the fact there's a widespread agreement. There's $50 billion in fraud every year in Medicare. That's $500 billion over 10 years. So a $3 billion savings through these efforts and a $500 billion problem over 10 years seems minuscule. So isn't that the area that everybody ought to start focusing in on to try to get a handle on the growth of the Medicare program, growth and spending of the Medicare program? Issues like phantom billing, stolen identification of seniors' patient information, stolen unique physician identification numbers that lead to, again, fraudulent and criminal activity. Shouldn't that be the focus of this panel? Shouldn't that have been the focus of the Affordable Care Act, to really get at really the real fundamental problems in the system, rather than keep setting up situations where doctors are going to get dinged for another 1 or 2% every year? Shouldn't that not be the focus of this panel and everybody in the healthcare delivery system?
I believe that going after fraud is a very important aspect of trying to improve the healthcare system over time. But I also believe that a lot of the numbers that get thrown around are into the broader category of fraud, waste, and abuse. And once you get beyond fraudulent billing and some of the things that you can easily throw someone into an orange jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary, you have more difficulty in terms of the subtleties of what is waste or abuse. You have the difficulties of patients and physicians, in some cases, wanting to do things for the right reasons, but then overdoing things, doing things inappropriately, and how accountable we hold them is a difficult thing. That puts you also down the road to a lot of very tough controls that people have been reluctant to do. In the fraud area, though, I would say some of the improvements that people are seeking in terms of the ability to track what happens, what the bills are, how large they are before the fact, before you actually pay, and going after them is a worthy thing to do. It's just going to be a little more difficult to get the big numbers, I think, because there's sort of happy conspiracy out there that people, what may be viewed as waste by some people is viewed as someone else's very important product.
Well, the Government Accounting Office put out a report that in 2010, there was $48 billion of improper payments. That's not just fraudulent activity, that's also just erroneous, unintentional administrative errors, but nonetheless is a waste of dollars that otherwise could be used to make sure there's quality and affordable care for the beneficiaries of the program. So we seem to get these reports periodically that there's massive amounts of waste, fraud, and abuse, and yet the best we can hear from the current Secretary of HHS is we're going to come up with $3 billion in savings over 10 years, and somehow, wow, we've done our job on all of this? Has your institute, have you done any studies on how to deal with waste, fraud, and abuse so that we tackle these very large numbers, which in turn, a portion of which could be making sure the physicians are getting a fair level of compensation for the patients they take care of?
We haven't looked at the fraud issue, but we have been focusing a lot on comparative effectiveness and some of the kinds of things of trying to talk about getting value for your dollar. I don't know about the recent GAO study, but an earlier one that they did that focused on fraud, waste, and abuse found that much of the amount was where the physician had not signed appropriately. And you don't know whether that's really fraud or whether it's simply administrative error. So I think we have to be a little careful of being optimistic we can get all our dollars from there. I wish it were true.
Well, you would agree we can hopefully get more than $3 billion over 10 years?
Yes, I hope we could do more
savings
than
than
that.
what the Secretary described?
I would like to see us get more than
The gentleman's time
Thank you.
expired.
Appreciate it.
Mr. Blumenauer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again for an opportunity to have this discussion, think through some of the issues. I was struck by Dr. Penson saying he didn't have the answers. He has some concerns about application, and I appreciate that. But I do think that the Affordable Care Act actually incorporates most of what the answers are. Unlike Dr. Gottlieb, we're not going to unwind Medicare. The fact that the federal government now pays about half the health care bill in this country. And we're this is part of the system. It's not going to go away. Hearken our Tea Party friends saying, keep government's hands off our Medicare. It's ingrained in the system. What we need to do is make it work better. And I couldn't agree more about the SGR. I thought it was bogus when I was here. I voted against it. I think an artificial formula that we can just kind of put it on autopilot and turn our back is wrong, and it's destructive. It's interesting to note, despite sort of some of the payment limitations, expenses continue to skyrocket up because, and I think several of you mentioned, we need to change the system that rewards value and outcomes, not just procedures. I agree with my friend from Pennsylvania. I don't know how big the fraud piece is, but I have joined him in legislation for a secure card. Whether it's $10 billion, $20 billion, $40 billion, there's a chunk of money that will enable us to be able not just to prevent loss of resources, but also have better control and protection for patients and have better data. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I don't think there's one thing that's going to solve the problem. I know SGR isn't, and if I had my way, I would get rid of it entirely. I would, in fact, be willing to have some of the permanent tax cuts. We battle over that. I'd have some of the tax cuts go away, buy out the SGR, get rid of it. It's a goofy thing, and we're always going to try and stop it, except when we stub our toe. And the uncertainty, I think, does cloud the practice of medicine for patients and doctors. But for me, the Affordable Care Act had all the elements that used to be bipartisan. A mandate, the dreaded mandate, was the creation of conservative think tanks as an alternative to Hillary Care. This was touted by some of our Republican friends. It was what Governor Romney, in a bipartisan way, established in Massachusetts. We have, end-of-life care that came out of this committee without dissent, strongly supported, somehow morphed into death panels and weirdness. I am hopeful that we can take this conversation about the IPAP and use it to kind of unwind some of these things. I don't want that to be the default mechanism. I think, and I appreciate suggestions people have to try and make it better, but it is there because Congress has consistently failed. It won't take recommendations. Everybody wants to go to heaven, nobody wants to die. So we talk about restraint and care, but then we blink on some things that aren't particularly controversial. And even now, we've had people on the committee talking about government problems with the health care reform and then looking at ways to spend more money. I'm hopeful that we can work with you to find out ways there might be some modest adjustment, but I hope it doesn't get to that point. It was specifically set up to give Congress a chance, and it isn't something that will happen unless Congress fails again. We've got the better part of a decade. Start moving. We've seen, and Ms. Moon, I appreciate you referencing it. There's some areas where we're seeing some progress made. Healthcare costs have not exploded of late. There's actually been a little restraint while we've been able to give some better service. I have people thank me that the kids are still on the parents' insurance policy, where kids are not going to have a problem with the pre-existing condition. But Congress needs a tool like this, because otherwise we'll do something really stupid like SGR. And I hope the framework of healthcare reform, good suggestions from people like you, and Congress realizing that we can't continue to blink, will result in this never having to be put in effect, and we will do our job. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't get to my question. I'm sorry. But I feel so much better. I feel so much better.
Good. The gentleman's time has expired. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. It is my sincere hope that given the bipartisan concerns that were raised here today, that this hearing will provide the foundation for this committee to move forward in addressing the dangers posed by this ill-conceived board. As a reminder, any member wishing to submit a question for the record will have 14 days to do so. If any questions are submitted, I ask that the witnesses respond in a timely manner. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.